Now, let's move on, because you and I are troubled by someone else as well, and I get constant either calls or emails about Rabbi Yechiel Eckstein of Fellowship of Christians and Jews. You and I are in no way supportive of this gentleman, and why don't you give your reason why, and
Sure.
then I will speak up.
Okay. Here again, Rabbi Eckstein, he has this television program, or it's more of an infomercial, called On Eagle's Wings, and again, he's trying to bring people out of the former Soviet Union into Israel. Again, we certainly have to endorse that and say that's a wonderful thing to do. But on the other hand, we have to be careful, because he has said some very strong things in regard to Jewish evangelism. One of the things that he has stated was that he actually has made a claim that Jewish evangelism is a form of spiritual genocide. Now, catch that terminology, genocide. That term has always been connected with the Holocaust. And it's almost as if he is saying that as his people have suffered and have been led astray and have been put to death physically the first time, now you Christians are doing that to us the second time spiritually. And I'm just totally abhorrent over a term like that. And even though, on the one hand, he's doing wonderful things, when I hear terminology like that, I would have to encourage those of us who are believers not to support a ministry like this.
Well, millions of evangelicals are supporting Rabbi Eckstein.
Yes.
They do not know what he sort of has a hidden or second agenda. You've just sort of summarized it there.
Right.
This sort of hidden agenda, because he's embraced by evangelicals, he's trying to get the message that Carl just explained a second ago here into the evangelical church. He is trying to encourage the evangelical church, yes, please, you must support Israel, and all the various reasons why. But please, would you leave the evangelism out in the parking lot?
And he has even said, Jan, to those who have, questioned him about this very thing, he says, I do certainly realize and respect the fact that Christians evangelize, and they have every right to do that. He says it on the one hand. On the other hand, then he makes claims that this is really nothing more than spiritual genocide, and I really take objection to that. And, Christians are giving tens of millions of dollars and that are being funneled to Israel, but under the guise of a ministry that is very, very adamantly against any type of evangelism.
All right. Probably more we could say, but folks, we've just tried to sound an alarm there that your donation dollars could be better spent in other places rather than to a Jewish organization that is denouncing in every way possible, witnessing evangelism to the Jewish people. We were talking earlier, Carl Johnson, about the Hebrew roots movement, and I think that personally it's about time that churches started emphasizing the Hebrew roots of Christianity.
Yes.
Unfortunately, some who are in this movement, and I am going to underline the word some, are not going to paint with a broad brush and say that this is a bad movement, but there are some in it that are taking it down. And why don't you explain your concern?
Yes, in every movement you have a spectrum of belief within it. You have those that are very orthodox all the way to those that unfortunately travel near of being heretical. And I think there have been some positive things that have come out of this movement. It has certainly allowed the church to understand its spiritual and Jewish connection because of Jesus and his disciples living in that context. So it's helped us to give a better understanding of our Jewish roots as Gentile believers today. On the other hand, you also see a tendency among these groups to have such an interest in this Jewishness that they neglect the gospel. In fact, the gospel is completely cast aside and relegated to the corner, and it really isn't something that we want to really embrace. On the other hand, we want to embrace some of this teaching. It is beneficial, it's helpful, but when they basically give the impression that evangelism is not needed, not worthwhile.
Was that a part of the original Jewish roots movement?
I'm not sure. The movement really goes back to the 60s, early 70s.
And so many things that started back then, including the Messianic movement, were very solid back then.
Yeah. I'm not sure if it had those elements early on, but certainly has evolved into that today. And by and large, the Hebrew Roots movement has nothing to do with evangelism. They're more focused upon wanting to discover their Jewish roots, and it's more of an educational aspect. But I think by neglect, though, they do themselves harm when they fail to at least look at that element as being essential to understand their Jewish roots.
All right. But again, there would be some within that movement who would not be at all happy with setting evangelism aside.
Of course.
I mean, again,
Yes.
we just can't paint with a broad brush and say that everyone in the movement is...
Right. There are those who would embrace it and those who certainly would discard it.
Right. So what we're looking for, folks, when we keep talking about various either individuals or movements in the church, parachurch organizations, various kinds of theologies, we're certainly looking for balance. I mean, we're looking for a healthy balance. And we're not just focusing necessarily today or at any time when I do any kind of a program. I'm not just looking at things that are the worst-case scenario within a movement. We spent a whole lot of time in the first part of this program indicating that Pastor John Hagee has done some great things when it comes to getting Christians to stand with Israel, but that there was a compromise in there. Okay, let's move on, Carl Johnson. And you have some concerns about organizations such as Bridges for Peace.
Yes, here's another. I mean, these ministries here are raised up. They love Israel. They support Israel, as you mentioned, and they certainly have done, in many regards, some wonderful things. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, they really cut the line when it comes to evangelism, and certainly they don't in any way talk about it as being important. Now, as we mentioned before, those that are doing the work in Israel, we understand to some regard.
To some degree.
To some degree. But what troubles me, though, is that they don't in any way support the idea that evangelism is important for Christians, whether they do it or not. So they really cut the line between themselves and any ministry that does have this desire to evangelize. It's almost like we can't be associated with them whatsoever. And by doing that, they really are cutting themselves off from what we as Christians really are, and that is to bring the gospel to the world.
Okay, that's the way that organization ministers in Israel. How might they be doing it in the Western world?
Well, I think it's probably a little bit different here in the West, certainly here in America. Again, their emphasis is educational,
okay.
and they really don't touch upon evangelism at all. And I think when it is brought up to them, they really do kind of push it aside. Again, because I think they want to walk that fine line, because they do have relationships with Jewish communities here in America as well.
That's right, they do. Yeah. And they're trying to maintain that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, I sort of get it, but again, when we're talking, I just always have to go back, Carl. When we're talking about eternity, and you and I believe that the days that we're in here are short as it is, yes. And that we need to be seizing every opportunity to share the gospel, more so now than 10 years ago and 20 years ago.
That's right. I think we believe that certainly the time is coming possibly to a close here. As we see world events happening, we see that storm coming where the end-time events seem to be coming nearer and nearer. And we realize that as Christians, our marching orders, Jan, is to bring the gospel. I mean, if we're not doing that, we are really neglecting one of the great responsibilities we have as believers have. I mean, we have been commanded, we have been urged to proclaim the gospel to every creature. And if we're not doing that, we are really neglecting one of the highest callings that God has given us.
To the Jew first.
To the Jew first. Paul says that, right? In Romans 1:16, absolutely.
Again, and we just have been referring here to Bridges for Peace, and I happen to know some folks who are involved in that. And they're wonderful, right-on Christians, and they have a heart for evangelism. Now, whether or not they can carry it out in that organization, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think that they can.
But, again, I just can't paint with a broad brush and say that everyone within that movement would be.
Let me say this in regard to Bridges. Yeah. At least, though, when we read some of their materials, they do say things like that Jesus is the way of salvation, and they even hint at the fact that there's coming a day when all Israel will be saved. So there is at least that insinuation there that there is one way, even though when it comes to evangelization, that they in fact stay clear of that, and obviously because of this this compromise, this fine line that they have to walk.
Yeah.